November 2013, a closed conference room in Beijing. No journalists, no cameras, no public announcement. Chinese President Xi Jinping quietly approves one of the most ambitious economic strategies in modern history. The world would come to know it as the Belt and Road Initiative. But inside Western intelligence circles, some analysts described it very differently. A slow-motion takeover, not through invasion, not through missiles, not through war, through money. And here is the question that should keep you awake at night. What if the biggest geopolitical shift of the 21st century is not a military conflict, but a contract? To understand what China is doing today, we need to go back to 1978. China at the time was poor, isolated, and still recovering from decades of internal turmoil. Then came Deng Xiaoping. He made a decision that would change global history forever. Open China to the world. Factories were built. Foreign investment flooded in, exports exploded. And while the world saw cheap products, China saw something else entirely: opportunity. By 2001, China entered the World Trade Organization. Western leaders celebrated. They believed economic integration would eventually transform China into a liberal democracy. That prediction failed spectacularly. Instead, China studied the global system from the inside. It learned how financial power works, how supply chains create leverage, how infrastructure shapes politics, and how debt can quietly influence nations without firing a single bullet. By 2008, China held nearly $900 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. It had become the factory of the world, but Beijing was no longer thinking only about manufacturing. It was thinking about influence. Then came 2013. Xi Jinping unveiled the Belt and Road Initiative, a massive global infrastructure network connecting Asia, Africa, Europe, and beyond. Roads, ports, railways, power plants, telecommunications systems. Eventually, more than 150 countries would join. Projected investment? Over $1 trillion. And this is the part many people misunderstood. This was never just foreign aid. This was strategy. Here is how the system works. China's state-owned banks, especially the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China, provide enormous loans to developing countries. The offers sound attractive. Low interest rates, long repayment periods, fast approvals, no lectures about democracy, no demands about human rights, just sign the agreement. But buried deep inside many of those contracts are clauses that experts say create enormous leverage for Beijing. Researchers at AidData analyzed over 100 Chinese loan agreements across dozens of countries. What they found raised alarms across the West. Some contracts contained confidentiality clauses preventing governments from publicly revealing the terms. Others included cross-default provisions, meaning China could demand repayment if a country acted against Chinese interests. In several cases, disputes had to be settled in Chinese courts or arbitration systems. This was not traditional development financing. This was geopolitical leverage written into legal language. And then there is the geography. Look carefully at where China invests: ports, shipping lanes, telecommunications hubs, railways, energy corridors. Not randomly, strategically. Take Pakistan. China invested over $60 billion into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. At the center of that project sits Gwadar Port, a deep-water port near the entrance to the Persian Gulf, one of the world's most critical oil shipping routes. Now look at Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan government borrowed heavily from Chinese banks to construct Hambantota port, but the port struggled financially. And when Sri Lanka could not repay its debts, China secured a 99-year lease on the port in 2017. 99 years, the same duration Britain once held Hong Kong. To many strategists, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. At first, the world reacted slowly, but eventually, alarm bells began ringing in Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, and Delhi. In 2018, the United States passed the BUILD Act, creating a major development finance institution designed to counter Chinese infrastructure financing. The European Union launched the Global Gateway Initiative, The G7 announced the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. Hundreds of billions of dollars were pledged. But there was a problem. China already had a massive head start. The ports had already been built, the railways already connected, the contracts already signed, the political relationships already established. And beneath the physical infrastructure was something even more important: dependency. Across Africa, Chinese companies constructed thousands of kilometers of railways and roads, power plants, and transmission lines. Entire sectors of national economies became connected to Chinese engineering, Chinese maintenance systems, and Chinese financing. But the real hidden layer was digital: Huawei, a company at the center of one of the largest technology controversies on Earth. By 2020, Huawei had built telecommunications infrastructure across dozens of countries. In Africa, Huawei helped construct core government communication networks in multiple nations, including the headquarters of the African Union in Ethiopia, a building funded and constructed by China. Then came a shocking discovery. Reports emerged that servers inside the African Union headquarters had allegedly been transmitting data nightly to Shanghai for years. The African Union initially denied the reports, but later quietly replaced the servers. The story never dominated global headlines, but inside intelligence communities, it intensified fears that infrastructure was not only about economics, it was about data. And in the modern world, data is power. Now, consider Greece. In 2016, Chinese shipping giant COSCO acquired a controlling stake in the port of Piraeus, one of Europe's most important maritime gateways, strategically positioned inside NATO territory. Soon afterward, Greece repeatedly blocked certain European Union statements criticizing China at the United Nations. Was it direct pressure? No definitive evidence proves that. But the pattern attracted attention across Europe, and similar patterns began appearing elsewhere. In 2021, Italy became the first G7 country to officially join the Belt and Road Initiative. But by 2023, Italy withdrew. Officially, leaders claimed the economic benefits failed to meet expectations. Unofficially, analysts pointed to growing concern over strategic dependence and pressure from allies like the United States. This is where the story becomes bigger than infrastructure. China is not simply constructing roads and ports. It is building networks of influence: economic influence, political influence, technological influence. A long-term system where Beijing becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. And according to multiple research groups, the scale is enormous. As of the early 2020s, dozens of countries reportedly had debt exposure to China exceeding 10% of their GDP. Countries like Pakistan, Kenya, Laos, Montenegro, Zambia. Zambia became the first African nation to default during the pandemic era. Debt restructuring negotiations became tense and complicated. Western creditors accused China of lacking transparency. China accused Western institutions of hypocrisy. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens suffered the economic consequences. But here is the uncomfortable reality many people ignore. Great powers have used financial influence before. The United States used strategic loans and economic leverage throughout the 20th century. European empires built railways and ports across colonies while calling it development. China did not invent geopolitical finance, it is modernizing it, and now the balance of power is shifting. Military strategists increasingly focus on something called the String of Pearls, a network of Chinese-linked ports and facilities stretching from the South China Sea through the Indian Ocean toward the Middle East and Europe. In a future crisis, these locations could become strategically important for trade routes, logistics, and naval operations. This is why governments across the world are paying attention. Because the infrastructure already exists. The ports exist. The contracts exist. The cables exist. The question now is what they eventually become. So what is the verdict? China is not secretly buying the world in the way conspiracy theories imagine. There are no hidden villains in dark rooms controlling everything. What China is doing is far more sophisticated. It is using legal financial systems, infrastructure investment, and long-term strategic planning to gradually expand influence across the globe. The winners so far are clear. Chinese state companies gain contracts, Chinese planners gain geopolitical positioning, and developing countries gain infrastructure they desperately needed. But there are losers too. Citizens trapped in debt crises, governments caught between superpowers, and an international order that suddenly faces a serious competitor. For the United States and its allies, the challenge is historic. Dollar dominance is being tested, alliance unity is under pressure, global supply chains are changing, and unlike war, this strategy unfolds slowly, quietly, one contract at a time. One port at a time. One railway at a time. The most important part? Much of it has happened in plain sight. So the real question is no longer whether China is building global influence. The evidence clearly shows that it is. The real question is whether the Western-led world can still offer an alternative powerful enough to compete, because the future may not be decided by bombs or invasions. It may be decided by infrastructure, finance, and who the developing world chooses to trust. So now we want to hear from